Hi, welcome back, guys. This is your friend the Momo Fanfics back with the amazing fanfiction. This is series of What If Deku Become a Spider-Man? When Spider-Man, Peter Parker, emerges through the portal, he finds himself in the middle of Japan, with nowhere to go, no idea where all the escaped bad guys from the raft went to, and no way of getting himself and those same villains home, no way home, you could say. So, for the time being until he found the Infinity Stones, he would make his home in Japan and restart his vigilante career from there. Peter would then go on to become an accomplished, but secret vigilante within the MHA world, keeping his head down to avoid the eyes of the pro-heroes, who would surely arrest him for his crimes. He first makes his debut by battling and defeating the villain group known as the Volcano Thieves all by himself, and, over the next 10 months, would go on to defeat the likes of Tesla and Muscle Man, both us villains. Spider-Man would continuously be making regular show jokes at the latter, mop up the remnants of Villain Factory alongside Knuckleduster, free Zookeeper from her mind control and defeat Bearhead and Curator, and prevent a plot by Dictator to mind control a horde of criminals into doing his bidding. Alongside defeating these villains, Peter, in his civilian identity, would assist Kazuko Hinyama, former Pop Step, and the rest of her idol group in publicly redeeming themselves after the Queen Bee incident and assist them in setting up their concert career, help Kazuko in seeing her boyfriend and later fiancé Koichi in America, assist Gentle Criminal and La Brava in setting up their YouTube career and turning them away from villainy alongside it, and take up work from the Yaoyorozu family as a tutor for their daughter Momo, eventually striking up a friendship with the girl, who would be impressed by his intelligence despite him only being a year older. Eventually, Peter would go on to befriend and redeem a group of villains composed of Magni and Mr. Compress, as well as meeting a civilian by the name of Inko Midoriya. And they would go on to create a homeless shelter for former villains and people with nowhere to go, and with public endorsement thanks to Kazuko's idol group as thanks from her and Koichi for helping them out, as well as the help and protection of a police officer by the name of Yuri Watanabe. They would then create a home for these people known as Feast, which Momo would take interest in. All the while, Peter would keep his eyes out for the Infinity Stones, desperately searching for both them and the villains that had come with him into this world, as he knows that the heroes of this world will not stand much chance against them, especially when they're united together under Osborn's control. However, after 10 months, he soon comes across Sandman, who was supposed to have gone straight back in their dimension, turned to as tall as a skyscraper and going on a rampage. Spider-Man would be forced to expose himself to the heroes in order to fight Sandman, but would soon realize that Marco was acting out of character, as he was suddenly more malicious and eager for blood. Realizing this, Spider-Man would lead Sandman down the streets, and the heroes would flood it with water, halting Sandman and returning him to his regular form. However, Marco would start fighting against himself, and Spider-Man would realize that there was something in his eye. With his help, Sandman would pull out the offending object that had burrowed into his eye, a mutated bee, and reveal that he hadn't been in control of his own body, as the bee had been in control of his actions. Spider-Man would first suspect Swarm, but he realizes that he couldn't control people like this. Then, Marco tells Spider-Man of an address in the city, and tells him that the people who enslaved him have his teenage daughter, Kimia, hostage. Before any of the heroes could stop him, Spider-Man sped off to the coordinates, a cadre of heroes hot on his heels. Breaking into the compound that Kimia was being held in, Spider-Man and the heroes would encounter Swarm, who was somehow in control of an entire gang's worth of villains and civilians, including Kimia, who has Sandman's powers as well, all of them with mutated bees burrowed into their left eye sockets. Spider-Man and the heroes would do battle with Swarm and his army of enslaved hostages, with Spider-Man desperately trying to free Kimia from Swarm's control. It is only when Endeavor arrives and creates a storm of fire that kills off most of the bees that the heroes can free Swarm's hostages and defeat him, with Spider-Man subduing Kimia and luring the mutated bee out of her eye. Swarm is thrown into custody, as is Sandman and Spider-Man for his vigilante actions. However, upon learning that Marco is refusing to talk to anyone other than Spider-Man, they allow the two of them to talk, to which Sandman reveals that Swarm didn't always have that power, and that someone by the name of All for One had given him a collection of mutated bees from an old villain known as Queen Bee to add to himself in order to control others. Sandman then reveals that this All for One guy had approached Green Goblin and the rest of the Raft villains with a proposal through a portal guy by the name of Kirigiri, not Spot. He clarifies, and had offered them the chance to join up with his League of Villains as he called it. Green Goblin had agreed, as had Scorpion, Electro, Rhino, Mysterio, and Vulture upon learning that it would help them kill Spider-Man. Spot had also agreed to join, as had Black Ant, Tarantula, Swarm, Hydro Man, Lady Beetle, and Delia. However, the rest had run off to do their own thing. Craven left and disappeared early one, as did Dr. Octopus. Shocker turned down the offer and went off to form his own team made out of White Rabbit, Boomerang, and Clash known as the Enforcers. Screwball went off to do her own thing, as had Taskmaster and the Tinkerer, whilst Tombstone left to form his own gang. Sandman had tried to decline and go straight, but it was too late for him, and Goblin and All for One had used Chemia to lure him away, only for Swarm to paralyze and take control of his body with his new mutated bees. They were using him as a distraction for some other objective, most likely the recovery of another Infinity Stone, most likely the Reality Stone. When Spider-Man asks how they were able to get their hands on Chemia, keeping the fact that they were in another universe a secret, Marco says that he has no idea, and Peter realizes that Goblin must have a way of moving between dimensions, meaning that he has the Space Stone. Unbeknownst to the both of them, the heroes, including All Might and Detective Naomasa, the latter of which censor parts of the interview so that the other heroes don't hear. However, they are unable to stop them from learning about All for One, which begins to spread rumors amongst the hero ranks, and results in All Might learning that All for One is alive much earlier than in canon. Upon reviewing Spider-Man's actions during the fight against Sandman and Swarm, as well as his rescuing of Chemia, Nezzy decides to offer Peter a place in UAS first year. Peter, upon realizing that it is either this or prison for his vigilantism, accepts, and he finds a place in Wana alongside Inko's son Izuku and Momo, who greet him as an old friend. Peter is quick to become friends with everyone in Class 1A, excelling in the quirk application test on the first day to his surprise, as he was considered a mediocre hero back in his dimension when compared to the older, more experienced pros such as the Avengers, Fantastic Four, and X-Men. On the second day, during the battle trials, Peter, thanks to his experience with defeating multiple villains before, would continue to dominate the class and come out on top of the mock battle, earning him both the praise of the rest of his class and the ire of those who would consider him their rivals, such as Todoroki and Bakugo. However, Peter would find himself unable to relax at UA, as he would continuously go out at night to sneak around the city in a new suit that he created known as the Stealth Suit or Noir Suit, as he called it, in order to either find the Infinity Stones or find any more of his villains. During one of these bouts, he would come across Spot and Lady Beetle looking for the Time Stone, and then defeat them and destroy their means of looking for the stones before Kirigiri rescues them. But now, with this action, Peter has placed himself in the crosshairs of All for One, and he takes up Green Goblin's suggestion to allow his men to kill him. Meanwhile, the rest of Class 1 votes Peter into the role of class representative. But upon realizing that his previous and current profession as a vigilante might damage their public image, as well as not wanting to be in such a prominent position in the class out of a desire to keep his own public image minimal on top of simple humbleness, Peter turns down the position and allows Yaoyorozu to take up the role of class representative, with Izuku becoming vice representative before giving up his position as well and handing it off to Ida after his handling of the break in Panic, an event that Peter would be suspicious of. Over the next 2 weeks, Peter would bond with the members of Class 1A, almost all of them eager to get to know him. especially after his performance in the battle trials, where he was forced to reveal to them that he was the vigilante Spider-Man. However, this particular fact would earn him the ire of more than a few of his classmates, particularly the likes of Ida and Suyu due to them wanting to stick to the law, which ends up sparking many debates between Peter and the students over when a person, hero or otherwise, should take action to do what is right. Meanwhile, Peter would find himself at odds with Bakugo, who would make it a personal mission to challenge Peter whenever he got the chance. Bakugo would do this in order to gain a rival in Peter to crush. Peter wouldn't care for it. Momo, meanwhile, would take umbrage with Peter's past as a vigilante, even if it was only the one incident that she knows about. But after seeing the work that Feast has put into helping those that have been persecuted and discriminated against, as well as Kazuko's idol group endorsing it, she and Todoroki, as well as a few people from Class 1B, would begin to discuss, with themselves and their families, setting up an organization to help fund Feast. Soon enough, Class 1A would depart to the USG, where the League of Villains would attack them. However, this time, instead of it being a horde of street-level villains, it is instead Shigaraki, Kurogiri, their Namu, and Green Goblin's men. Green Goblin would announce himself and his closest cohorts Mysterio, Vulture, Scorpion, Rhino, and Electro as the Sinister Six, and sent their minions, Spot, Delia, Hydro Man, Black Ant, Tarantula, and Lady Beetle after them. Class 1A and their teachers would attempt to fight back against the new League of Villains, but would be scattered by Kurogiri over the USG and would be hunted down by the villains. As Spider-Man is confronted and forced to take on the Sinister Six all by himself, whilst Aizawa and 13 are busy with Shigaraki and his Namu, the rest of Class 1A would be forced to contend with the villains under the Sinister Six's command. They are soon forced to realize that while these villains are always being defeated by Spider-Man, they are much more dangerous than the standard street-level villain, and find themselves constantly on the back foot. Even the Spot is able to get one up on Bakugo of all people, and he is considered the comic relief of the Sinister Six's minions. Even worse, all of these villains consider the children that they are fighting against to not be worth the effort. They're only interested in fighting Spider-Man. This fight is meant to illustrate a point as to why Spider-Man is considered to be one of the best in the class. During his time as a vigilante and hero back in his home dimension, Peter was constantly battling against and defeating these villains. And while many of these villains are weak by Marvel standards and are always being defeated by Peter, they are still dangerous villains that ordinary civilians and police forces cannot handle. So, against the likes of the MHA cast, especially the students, even lesser villains like Black Ant and the Spot are able to go toe-to-toe with the main characters of MHA. TLDR: Spider-Man is one of the best in UA's hero course, because his villains are just as, if not even more so, dangerous as he is. It's also my way of deconstructing the typical variant of shounen battles, when a kid goes up against a fully grown adult. Here, what happens when a teenager with hardly any training under their belt goes up against an adult with months, perhaps even years, of experience? They get curb stomped hard. During all of this, Peter finds himself to be on the back foot against the Sinister Six, and is barely able to keep up with them as he covers Ida in making a break out of the USG to get help, to which he then keeps his 6 opponents focused on him and away from the speedster. However, he is once more put on the back foot by the Sinister Six, and is forced to retreat from them as they threaten to overwhelm him. Meanwhile, the rest of Class 1A are forced to rely on their numbers to try and take down the 7 villains that were fighting them, but are unable to defeat the more experienced fighters and are almost beaten entirely, as is Aizawa and 13 against Shigaraki and his Namu. However, the tide of the battle soon turns against the villains when All Might and the heroes arrive. Suddenly, the 6 minions of the Sinister Six would be forced to contend with heroes that are at their level, and the Sinister Six would be occupied by All Might, whilst Peter would soon enough go forth and use his experience with the 7 villains under the Sinister Six's command to defeat them. Soon enough. All Might goes into battle against Green Goblin, whilst Peter and his friends go up against the Namu and defeat it. Green Goblin is unable to defeat All Might, even with a Space Stone and Reality Stones in his possession, and so he and the rest of the League of Villains retreat, meaning that the heroes have won the day. However, all the current members of the League would escape, meaning that the heroes would be taking no prisoners this day. The second series would begin in the aftermath of the Uschi confrontation, where Spider-Man would spend much of his nights alienating between searching for the rest of the stones and tracking down the League of Villains and the Sinister Six. However, thanks to pressure from All Might, who, for some reason, had taken an interest in him for reasons that he couldn't guess, he is forced to cut down these excursions, lest he invite consequences onto the people around him for his vigilantism. And so, dejectedly, he would spend the next month until the sports festival training and teaching the likes of Kendo, Siro, Tsuyu, and others in both Class 1A and 1B how to fight, working with Hatsume and the support department on making a new costume for himself, since his classic costume got shredded in the USG, and working at Feast alongside Inko, Twice, Magni, and Mr. Compress, as well as the newly released Kimia, who, like Peter, can't get back home and decides to simply stick around until they do. But of course, Parker luck strikes again, as they find themselves under fire from the likes of Taskmaster, who has been hired by an unknown employer to collect DNA from Peter for an unknown purpose. All the while Feast begins feeling pressure from unfriendly heroes who want to shut the organization down for whatever purposes they may have. However, Momo and Todoroki are able to pull through by using their family's power and influence, as well as Kazuko's idol group and their public appeal, and Gentle's YouTube channel to spread their message across the platform, and even Yuri's police connections as an officer herself, to protect Feast and all the people who stay there and force the pro-heroes to back off and leave them alone for the time being. Soon enough, the news begins to report on this combined effort, and speculates that this may be the beginning of some sort of partnership between all these different parties. Said parties, upon hearing this, decide to go along with it and make their professional relationship official. Only Yuri would step away from this, wanting to keep the police neutral in these affairs and free of political bias. Meanwhile, Taskmaster would be tracked down by the number 3 pro-hero known as Hawks, overwhelmed by the HPSC assassin, and killed in order to silence their employment of him. Soon enough, the sports festival comes about, and Peter finds himself uncomfortable with the idea of going out onto the stage without his mask on, as his many enemies might be watching and figure out who his friends and family are. However, said friends and himself petition to wear new experimental outfits that they had all designed together for their burgeoning foundation, and it is accepted. Spider-Man takes to the stage in an all-new white and black costume, alongside his friends in similar outfits. And when he is called up to give the opening declaration, Peter calls up his friends onto the stage, and together, they make a grand speech and declare themselves as the future's foundation. Thus, the media would christen this team, and the subsequent organization that they had made, the Future Foundation. Like Danganronpa? No, not like Danganronpa. The sports festival would begin, and Peter and his friends, with their advanced training, would go on to dominate the first round, that being the obstacle course, though they would find themselves being split up for the second round, which here is a team game of capture the flag, in which Peter would be forced to stay by the flag and let his teammates bring their captured flags back to him meta-wise. This is just to let the other characters of 1A and B have some time to shine without Peter hanging over them. Peter's team would go on to win the second round, and as such they would be divided up between the rounds. However, Todoroki would pull away Peter and ask him if he is All Might's secret love child, which Peter would, of course, refute. Todoroki would then tell Peter of his past, and why he refuses to use the fire aspect of his quirk, and Peter would be left with a bitter, uncomfortable taste in his mouth, remembering back to normal Osborn, Green Goblin's abuse of his son, Harry. Determined to prevent history from repeating itself, Peter would try to ask Todoroki how he could help, And Todoroki simply tells him to win the next round, and when they compete, to give it his all, so that Todoroki can say that he defeated the closest thing to All Might in their class with just his ice. Todoroki leaves him alone, and Peter is left feeling unsure of what to do. First up would be Kendo versus Kirishima, and she would end up using her opponent's strength against him and force him out of the ring. Second would be Ida versus Monoma, and the latter would end up copying the former's quirk to deliver a kick that would send him flying out the ring. Third would be Peter versus Setsuna, and he would use his web shooters to tangle up her limbs and keep her immobile. After that would be Ochako versus Tetsutetsu, and the Gravity Girl would manage to float the Metal Boy out of the ring and claim the victory. Next would be Momo versus Shiro, and the two of them would have a long and drawn-out battle before Momo eventually came out victorious. Sixth would be Hatsune versus Bakugo, and she would end up using their match as a marketing scheme to advertise her inventions before forfeiting, leaving Bakugo with a bitter taste in his mouth. Seventh would be Ashido versus Todoroki, and the Acid Girl wouldn't even stand a chance as the dual quirk user buried her under a landslide of ice, sending her out of the competition. The eighth and final battle of the first bracket would be Midoriya versus Shinso, and this is when we get a real look into his mind and perspective on things, showing that while he's happy to be at the sports festival and giving it his all with all his friends, he can't help but feel inadequate when compared to the likes of Peter and his friends, and feels the need to prove that he is as much a hero as everyone else. During this match, we also learn that One for All works somewhat differently in this story than in canon, and that instead of 7 consciousnesses lingering inside of it, there is only one, which is an amalgamation of all the wielders who have come before. What's more, the physical symptoms of One for All are a lot more pronounced. Strands of black whip are more visible from the start, almost like they're covering him when he uses it. And the consciousness inside One for All has taken a liking not to Izuku, but to Peter. Back to the next round of the tournaments, and it would be Bakugo versus Monoma, Peter versus Momo, Kendo versus Todoroki, and Izuku versus Ochako. Not in that order though. First would be Kendo versus Todoroki, and the latter would be surprised by the former's resistance. Kendo is one of the students that trained with and under Peter, but would eventually defeat her. During the second match, Bakugo would be enraged by Monoma copying his quirk and swiftly defeat his opponent. Izuku and Ochako would be next, and to the surprise of many, Ochako would defeat Izuku handedly, to which Izuku would be left feeling both happy for Ochako that she was heading off to the finals, and yet also bitter with himself as his insecurities deepen with the loss. Finally would come Peter versus Momo, and although Momo would put up stiff resistance against him, Peter would eventually overpower and defeat her, the two of them thankfully leaving the match with equal respect for each other. In the aftermath of the second round of the third event, Peter would speak with Todoroki once more, and, in broad terms, explain to him what Green Goblin had done to Harry, without actually naming them. Todoroki would brush him off and demand that he go all out in their next match, remaining firm in his desire to defeat Peter with just his ice, and Peter retorts by asking Todoroki what he wants. Todoroki is confused, and Peter goes on to ask if he wants to be a hero, or if he wants to spite his father. He then says that by letting his grudge against his father control him, he is, by proxy, letting his father rule over him. Todoroki leaves in thought, and Peter is left with a feeling of unresolved feelings within him. Soon enough, the semifinals would come about, and it would be Bakugo versus Peter and Ochako versus Todoroki. Bakugo and Peter's match would be first, and it should be noted that throughout the entirety of the sports festival, Bakugo has been continuously attempting to spark up a rivalry with Peter, only to be ignored and rebuffed due to Peter's dislike of rivalries. Now, angered further by his previous matches and unable to keep his rage down, Bakugo would battle against Peter, and he would lose, as it turns out, while for the most part, when Bakugo's anger helps to give him control most of the time, when it reaches a boiling point, he is unable to control his anger and leaves him easily predictable. This match in particular is meant to deconstruct two tropes in storytelling: rage breaking points and rivalries. The first one is meant to make it clear that, while sometimes anger can be used as a method of focusing and controlling one's own actions, it can also make someone wildly irrational and dangerous, causing them to lash out and therefore make them more predictable, especially when someone who seems to just always be angry reaches their breaking point. The second trope that is being deconstructed, that being rivalries, is meant to show that this trope only works when the other character in this rivalry reciprocates the feeling. And when they don't, the one trying to spark the rivalry comes across as unlikable and needlessly confrontational, and makes it difficult to want to talk to them about anything. After this, Todoroki would battle against Ochako, and although Ochako would put up severe resistance against him, Todoroki would come out on top, though he would have pushed himself to his limits, and would be moments away from being thrown out of the ring himself. In the intermission between rounds, Peter would talk with Momo, herself having put together what is happening with Todoroki herself, and they would discuss what to do with Todoroki during their upcoming match. Peter would express his dislike of fighting against Todoroki when he is clearly hurting, as he isn't a villain, but a victim. Momo, however, would express that holding back against Todoroki would be a sign of disrespect to him, to which he responds that he holds his punches back because he didn't want to turn anyone into a splatter on the walls. It is canonical that Peter always restrains himself and holds back his punches, and Todoroki is holding himself back anyway. Momo suggests trying to beat him to understand that holding back won't help him become a hero, but Peter wonders if that will even solve the problem. While this conversation is going on, the match for third place between the losers of the semifinals would take place between Bakugo and Ochako. However, Bakugo would be rattled by his previous losses, almost on the verge of a panic attack because of it and his psychological need to always win, and as such he would be unable to concentrate, handing Ochako the victory. "I just wanted to do justice to Ochako, okay? Let me have this." Soon enough, the time for Peter and Todoroki's match would arrive, and Momo and Peter would be forced to finish their conversation. Momo would go on to express how the best way to help Todoroki may be to beat him in this match and prove his methods to be unreliable. But Peter cannot help but feel like that would just force him to double down on his methods and refuse to learn anything. Soon enough, the final match between Peter and Todoroki would begin, and Todoroki would throw icy glacier after glacier at him, only for them to prove to be ineffective, as he would simply dodge and weave around them with little effort. Todoroki, feeling slighted by this, assumes that Peter is mocking him and demands that he stop holding back. However, this was all part of Peter's plan, as he had dodged and weaved enough around Todoroki's glaciers to make a dome of ice around them. And Peter would stop and, using the sphere of ice around them to stop people from looking and listening in, attempt to talk to Todoroki once more. Todoroki would tell Peter that he could end this match in an instant with another ice attack, and Peter goes on to say that he could. There was very little that Peter could do against Todoroki right now, and there was very little stopping him from simply covering him in ice and ending the match right there and then. However, Peter wonders if that would really give him any satisfaction in victory, and Todoroki demands he explain himself. Peter then asks Todoroki why he wants to become a hero, and Todoroki explains that it is because he wants to prove that he can succeed with just his ice. However, Peter counters that that doesn't explain why he wants to be a hero, as he can go into any profession and use just his ice to succeed. In fact, the best thing that he could have done to spite Endeavor would be to simply not become a hero and chose some other career path. But instead Todoroki chose to become a hero. So why? Todoroki finds himself unable to answer, and so Peter continues. He finally expounds on the story of Harry and Norman Osborn, names and all, and explains to Todoroki that after the death of Harry's mother and Norman's wife, Emily Lyman, to cancer, Norman had sunk into a deep depression and took it out on his son, always finding ways to blame him for his mother's demise. However, in losing her, Norman wanted to find a way to bring her back, and he figured that the best way to do so would be to become the closest thing to a god that the world had ever seen. As such, he devoted himself to the field of science, and eventually created the G serum from which to complete his ambitions. This was what led to the creation of the Green Goblin, and it was in this chaos that he took to making his son's life a living hell. Harry, Peter's friend, would always be trying to flee from his father, find ways to spite him for this treatment, and eventually took to taking the G serum himself to destroy him. In doing so, Harry turned himself into the Hobgoblin and was killed by the original Green Goblin for this. In trying to spite his father, Harry had ended up becoming just like him, and Peter refused to let history repeat itself again. Todoroki is shaken by this story, and Peter continues on. He tells Todoroki that if he continues down this path of allowing his father to dominate his thoughts, then he would end up just becoming like him. The best way that he can spite Endeavor is to embrace who he is as a person and move on from him. Todoroki asks if that means that he should be like his father, and Peter says that he should instead be Shoto Todoroki. The best way to get revenge on a person is to simply live a better life than them, Peter says. And if Todoroki thinks that's the best way to do that is to become a hero, then so be it. Todoroki hears his words and thinks back to his mother's own words to him. His fire blooms, and he frees himself, melting the ice around them. Todoroki makes a quick comment about how Peter hadn't got at him over holding back his fire, and Peter says that he'd be a hypocrite for doing so. Todoroki asks if they should continue the match, and when Peter says that that's up to him, Todoroki says that he'd like to go and rest now. As such, Peter forfeits the match, and Todoroki is declared the winner. Finally, after so long, at peace with himself. This match, and this entire arc, is also my way of deconstructing the idea of warrior therapy, in that the best way to solve a person's issues is to punch them out of them. As I wish to show, this is an ineffective form of therapy, and that sometimes the best thing to do is not to punch a person in order to get them to listen, but just simply lend an ear. It's also my way of showing that, underneath all the webs and quips, Peter is a very empathetic person, and is more than willing to sit down with someone in order to help them. Soon enough, the sports festival for the first years reaches its end, and many would be looking towards the future. Ochako would be bombarded by ecstatic classmates and fans about how well she did, and how many internship offers she was going to receive, before being approached by Nejire on behalf of Ryukyu. Bakugo would be lost in a day, his confidence completely shattered as he tries to understand how he lost for the first time in his life. Momo would receive warm congratulations from her parents, as she is offered an internship directly from Fat Gum. Todoroki would go on to reconnect with his mother and siblings, and would eventually decide, alongside Fayumi and Natsuo, to move to a different house in order to distance themselves from Endeavor and force him to clean up his image. Mirko would take an interest in kendo, whilst Kirishima and Tetsutetsu both decide to join Peter's training group to improve themselves and become stronger. Meanwhile, Peter would simply decide, after the festival, to skip out on the celebrations and head back to feast, only to be stopped by the rest of his friends as they practically drag him away to celebrate their successes. And Izuku, meanwhile, would simply be left with a gnawing feeling of inadequacy in his gut. In the next week between the sports festival and the internships, Peter would be moved to the sidelines as we explore the new changing world. In the League of Villains, Green Goblin and All for One had argued over whether or not to attack the sports festival, with Green Goblin having wanted to kill Spiderman, whose name hadn't been revealed during the event for security reasons, and completely destroy the stadium, whilst All for One had reined him in and told him to hold back and watch events play out, allowing them to gather information on the students and on Spider-Man himself. Goblin is quick to remind All for One that they are partners, and he is not subservient to him, and they both continue to plan against each other. Meanwhile, Detective Naomasa begins to investigate a series of burglary and robberies on several wealthy agencies and pro-hero homes, with the only clues left behind being a series of cat pictures left behind. All the while, Feast begins to receive anonymous donations from an online source calling themselves the Cat. Detective Yuri Watamote, meanwhile, would begin to uncover evidence of gang-related violence to Tombstone's criminal gang. Several of her men would then be killed in a villain attack in an attempted assassination attempt on her in retaliation for the investigation. Yuri would begin to wonder if she should start taking matters into her own hands. Elsewhere, the hero killer Stain would make himself known by murdering several pro-heroes around the city of Hasu, which would soon enough attract the attention of several other pro-heroes and villains, particularly Spider-Man and his crew. Knowing that this would take time out of his efforts to track down the Infinity Stones, as well as the Sinister Six and the League of Villains, Spider-Man would decide to hunt him down and stop any more murders. But before he can do this, he would end up developing a new suit alongside Hatsune in the support department of UA, eventually developing a new set of silver armor known as the Spider Armor, the purpose of which he would keep hidden from her and everyone else. However, getting in the way of this is Ida, who is seeking to avenge his brother for what has been done to him. For in this timeline, Stain did not just defeat Tensei, Tenya, Ida's older brother. He also killed him. Soon enough, the day of the internships would arrive, and Peter would disregard many of the other internships to take up one in Hasu with a hero by the name of Native. However, he would soon realize that Ida, upon hearing of his elder brother's murder at the hands of Stain, has taken an internship in Hasu as well, and is gunning for the villain as well. Peter would soon be torn between trying to take down Stain and protecting his classmate. Peter and Ida would have several arguments about what to do, and who is in the right for their arguments. Meanwhile, All for One would bring Stain to the League of Villain to try and get an alliance between him and Shigaraki. In retaliation for All for One holding him back from attacking the sports festival, Green Goblin would intentionally sabotage the meeting between the two parties, making Stain walk out on the League and return to Hasu. Angered, Shigaraki would summon forth several Namu to take with him to Hasu, and Goblin would be forced to send out the minions of the Sinister Six to support him. Soon enough, Ida and Peter would come across Stain right when he is about to murder Native and Manuel, and the two of them would battle against the villain right before they realize that the two pro-heroes are bleeding out. Spider-Man would be forced to drag Ida away from the villain as he takes them and the two wounded pro-heroes away to safety, allowing the villain the chance to flee, just as the League of Villains and their Namu and villains besiege Hasu. Spider-Man and the pro-heroes would go on to fight against the villains that All for One and Goblin had sent out, that being Lady Beetle, Black Ant, Tarantula, Delia, Hydro Man, and Spot, as well as the League's Namu as they attacked the city. All the while Ida, undeterred, would move to try and hunt down Stain all over again, the villain slinking around in the shadows to try and evade capture. However, Stain would be caught by a particular villain, who, despite being quirkless, would overwhelm and defeat the villain, impaling him on his own sword, and letting him choke and paralyze himself with his own blood before expiring. Craven the Hunter would take Stain's sword as a trophy, and leave the corpse for Ida and the pro-heroes to find. Meanwhile, Spider-Man and the heroes would go on to defeat the rest of the villains and Namu, rounding up the villains outside of the main Sinister Six group, save and managing to incapacitate and capture the remaining Namu for study. Spider-Man would spend his time saving as many civilians as he could alongside Izuku and Todoroki from the collateral damage caused by the fighting, whilst the Sinister Six's minions, lacking in experience against the other older and more veteran pro-heroes like Endeavor and Gran Torino, would find themselves getting trounced and taken down by their opponents. Shigaraki, Kirigiri, and the main Sinister Six would escape, but their number of skilled fighters would be severely depleted thanks to Shigaraki and Goblin. The two groups inside the League would begin to fracture further as they both make plans to betray the other. Back with the heroes, Spider-Man, along with Ida, Todoroki, and Izuku are taken to the hospital to treat any injuries that they had suffered from. and Peter and Ida are taken to task for their parts in trying to track down Stain, with the heroes figuring out that his new armored suit had been designed to combat Stain. However, they cannot do anything about it because Spider-Man, Todoroki, and Izuku were seen saving civilians during the fighting, meaning that they have alibis, and even then they don't have any real proof that Peter and Ida had been going against Stain. Both because at the time of their fight, Native and Manuel were both delirious from blood loss. They are both alive though, thankfully. And also there's no one else around to confirm that the fight ever truly happened since Stain was found murdered in an alleyway not too far away from the city. As such, Spider-Man and Ida are let go, but are put under watch back in UA to make sure that they don't go vigilante once again, especially Peter. However, without the catharsis of defeating Stain in canon, Ida finds himself unable to let go of the anger inside of him and begins to feel resentment to Peter for stopping him from finishing Stain off. Heading back to UA, Peter would be put under strict supervision during his time at the school to prevent him from running off on vigilante work, making it difficult for him to continue searching for the rest of the Infinity Stones and tracking down the Sinister Six. Not to mention he's shaken by Stain's murder and wonders who did it, and if Goblin is pulling back more villains from his home dimension, or anyone else. But then one night, he gets a message from someone whom he wasn't expecting, and meets up with an old friend of his, a fellow vigilante and master thief known as Felicia Hardy, or Black Cat, who encourages Peter to ditch the heroes and go back to his old vigilante ways. Back in UA, Peter goes back to repairing his classic suit, alongside Hatsune and his friends in the hero course, particularly Momo, Zero, and Kendo. Meanwhile, he, as well as Todoroki and Izuku, would receive further exposure for their parts in rescuing the people of Hasu, though Peter and Todoroki would receive more exposure than Izuku, who would uncharacteristically begin to feel something close to resentment at that fact, not helped by the voice of One for All whispering into his ear. Soon enough, the day of the final exams would come about, and Peter would be teamed up with Momo in order to pass their opponent, Snipe. Momo would freeze up during the exam, unsure of what to do, and even Peter would find himself being suppressed and pinned down by Snipe, the sharpshooting hero anticipating every movement and forcing him to fall back to Momo for support. But then, upon seeing her friend in trouble, Momo would soon enough overcome her hesitation and propose a plan to Peter to take down Snipe, which he would agree to. The two of them, with Momo leading the assault and Peter following behind, would defeat and capture Snipe, passing the exam. This part is also because I wanted to do Momo some justice looking out for you, not Burger King, and also make sure that not everyone's problems and lives revolve around Peter. Others, however, would not be so lucky with their exams. Todoroki and Bakugo would be teamed up in their exams, and Todoroki would use Bakugo's insistence to attack their tester, Aizawa, to speed to the exam and pass. Meanwhile, Izuku and Ochako would be teamed up against All Might, and they would just barely pass their exam against the number one hero. Upon seeing how easily the others, particularly Peter, had passed their exams compared to his, that uncharacteristic pool of resentment inside Izuku's chest would only begin to grow. In the meantime, Peter would continue his work at Feast alongside Inko, Kimia, who Inko has taken into her home until Flint Marco is released from prison, Twice, Momo, and Mr. Compress, and would end up taking all of the representatives of the burgeoning Future Foundation, alongside Izuku and Ochako, to see Kazuko and her idol group perform live. Here, though, Peter and Momo would end up running into Black Cat, who is temporarily acting under the role of her civilian guise Felicia Hardy, and joins Peter at the concert alongside his friends. Soon enough, Momo and Felicia would engage in a debate over what the right thing to do as a hero is, with Momo arguing that the best way for a hero to operate is within the confines of the law and the people who make them, whilst Felicia counters by saying that the law can be restrictive and prevent heroes from saving as many people as they can, and the people who make the laws tend to be just as in the wrong as the ones who make them. This is all the beginning of the biggest theme that I wanted to discuss in this story. The contention between the morals of Spider-Man and the phrase "with great power comes great responsibility," and MHA's Hero Society, and how the two deconstruct and clash against each other. Soon enough, Peter and his friends would be taken by All Might to Island as a reward for completing their entrance exams, as well as giving himself a chance to meet up with his friend David Shield and his daughter Melissa. Peter begins to talk to David, finding him interesting to listen to as he spoke about how the solutions to many of mankind's genetic diseases and problems could be from the animal kingdom itself. However, during their conversation, Peter would notice a vial of green blood on David's desk, and with a little bit of prodding, would answer that it was a vial of blood recovered from a battle months ago against a villain from the USG attack. David had been sent the sample to experiment with, and had seen how it had augmented the person that had used it, and had combined it with lizard DNA to see if it could solve the problem of limb replacement. But so far all his experiments have come up with failures. Peter quickly realizes that this is the Green Goblin's blood, and is barely comforted by the fact that David hasn't experimented on any living things, of which he refutes on moral and ethical concerns. But then the island is attacked by Wolfram and his villains, having been tipped off to a powerful device being monitored at Island by Samuel, David's partner. Spider-Man and his friends try to intervene, but the villains lock down the island and confront Connors about the project, as he had been working on it as well. When David at first denies the project's existence, and then refuses to allow them to have it, Wolfram, in a rage, injects the rejected hybrid blood into Connors, intent on letting him die slowly from it. Instead, David is mutated by the blood, and transforms into a monstrous, mindless creature known as the Lizard. The Lizard soon goes on a rampage, forcing Spider-Man to go after him to try and contain him. In the scientist lab, Momo, Melissa, and the others try to manufacture a cure for David's condition, but find that they are unable to and have to focus on Wolfram and his goons as they run amok through the artificial island. Meanwhile, Peter goes up against the Lizard, but is unable to talk the now mindless and mutated David down, and is forced to try and incapacitate the raging monster. However, the Lizard is too strong for him to take down, and he is forced to retreat as the Lizard continues its rampage. Wolfram, meanwhile, Samuel about their project, and Samuel, under hopes of receiving a massive payment for his efforts, leads him to the project in question, a major source of power that they had been using to power the entire island in lieu of any generators, the Power Stone. Wolfram then kills Samuel and takes the stone for himself, leaving Island without any power as it begins to sink into the ocean. With the power out across the island, All Might is freed from his confines, and he meets up with Spider-Man to both defeat the Lizard, driving it back and forcing it into the water. Realizing that Wolfram is the bigger threat, both All Might and Spider-Man are forced to leave the Lizard for now and head off to chase after the terrorist, who has just finished executing the rest of his cohorts, no longer needing them, and having been driven mad by the Power Stone's unlimited, power. With Momo and the others, they figure out that the island has backup generators and move to activate them before Island sinks into the sea, drowning everyone aboard. Fighting their way through the rogue security bots in their way, Momo and Melissa are able to restore power to the backup generators, refloating Island once more and saving everyone's lives. With that done, they move to join Peter and All Might at the top of the island. Up above, Spider-Man and All Might find themselves unable to defeat Wolfram, the villain too juiced up on the Power Stone, and throwing too many attacks at them to be beaten by conventional means. Each attack that they throw at the villain is blocked and countered with an overwhelming riposte. Nothing that they do is working. But then, they get word from Momo and Melissa, and they suggest using the backup generators to feed excess power into him, so much that he will overheat from the power and burn up. Peter is against this plan, as it would mean killing Wolfram, which is not something that he nor his friends are willing to do. But All Might tells all of them that there is no other way, and they are forced to accept that. So, All Might and Peter keep the power-drunken Wolfram's attention on them, keeping him distracted and allowing Momo and the others to push electricity into Wolfram, overloading the Power Stone and flooding him with energy. Eventually, Wolfram is unable to contain and control the power of the Infinity Stone in his possession, and he overloads, releasing his grip on the Power Stone, but resulting in being rendered catatonic, functionally brain-dead now thanks to the stone. Peter and the others are upset at this outcome, especially with all the other deaths today, even if all of them are on the villain's side. The fact that no innocent people were killed and the island was saved is able to soothe them over. However, that salve is worsened when they find the lizard, the mutated David Shield, escaping from the artificial island and swimming away to parts unknown. In the aftermath of the battle, Island is left to rebuild, but Melissa is inconsolable at the loss of her father and his mutation into a monster, on top of the betrayal and death of someone that she saw as an uncle. Peter, Izuku, All Might, and the others would attempt to console her, but she would request time to be on her own, needing space to process everything that has happened to her. Then, All Might confronts Peter and reveals that he knows that Peter has something to do with the stones that Green Goblin used in his glove, as well as the one that Wolfram was using as well. Peter is forced to reveal that the stones are a source of power, and he's been desperately trying to recover them in order to seal them away and make sure that no one could use them for their own sinister purposes, like Goblin and Wolfram were. All Might is hesitant to believe this, suspicious and obvious to the fact that Peter is still hiding things from him and the others, but remembers all the good that he's done already, with Sandman and the USG, whatever was happening with Todoroki, Hasu, and now Island, and decides to take his word on it. Peter then raises the question of why David and Samuel had the Power Stone and Green Goblin's blood, and, after looking over Island's computer files, find that there is nothing on the systems that give them any answers, nor any paperwork that they can find. David, Samuel, and Wolfram were the only ones who knew about the Power Stone, and now with Samuel dead, Wolfram comatose, and their minions all deceased, the only one with the answers that they needed was David. And he was a mutant lizard monsters now, gone go who knows where. If they truly wanted answers to their questions, they would need to find and cure him as soon as possible. Soon enough, once Island is repaired and operational once more, and once all the civilians inside are safe and sound as well, Peter and the others would leave the island and head back for the mainland, the Power Stone in their possession, and their bonds still strong thanks to their combined efforts in both defeating the villains and saving the innocent. Though somewhat strained now due to the fact that Peter was hiding things from them, now becoming clear. Series 3 begins with Spider-Man and All Might searching all across Japan for the lizard, as this was where the mutated David was supposedly traveling to, according to Selkie and their hero friends along the shore who had spotted him. However, after days and even weeks of searching, they have come up with nothing and are disheartened by it. Soon enough, Peter's friends are able to convince him, and All Might by extension, to take a break from the search for some time and give themselves some rest. The two of them agree, albeit reluctantly, and they decide to try and relax with a trip to the mall. But of course, Parker luck strikes again as elsewhere. The forces of the League of Villains are rallying their forces to attack the upcoming summer training camp. Goblin has assembled his Sinister Six, but doesn't see the point in attacking the school, as it makes no pragmatic sense to him beyond killing Spider-Man. And even then, there were many other chances for him to do so, which he had been restrained from doing once again. Shigaraki, however, would have all for one hold themselves off until the day of the summer training camp, since he wanted to kidnap Bakugo and recruit him into the League of Villains, which the Sinister Six would grate at but be forced to acquiesce to. Even worse is the cadre of new villains that their local contact, Jiren, had supplied them with. Barely anything, really, thanks to Feast taking in all the villains and giving them homes and shelters. Even worse are their attitudes, as most of the Sinister Six cannot stand them, viewing them as unprincipled and inexperienced thugs. Moonfish is nothing more than a mindless cannibal, Spinner rants about how he wants to avenge Stain nonstop. Muscular is always ranting about wanting to fight, and seems like a hair trigger away from attacking everyone in the room. Mustard only cares about pursuing his resentment on heroes. Dabai is keeping his cards close to his chest, and talks about wanting to avenge Stain, which Shigaraki hates and Goblin finds amusing. And Toga is the worst one of them all, fangirling about Spider-Man only to say that she desires to see him covered in blood, and then drink of his blood to become him. This is only made worse by the costume that she made for herself that is a mimicry of Spider-Man's, and the alias that she has taken for herself, being that of Blood Spider. Suffice to say, the Sinister Six hate her. Goblin would leave, needing to clear his head, and hidden underneath a cloak, he would find Peter wandering about in the mall on his own, and confront him. At first, Peter would feign ignorance at the Goblin, only for Osborn to reveal something that horrifies the fledgling superhero. Norman Osborn reveals that he knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Peter is horrified by this, and Norman makes it clear that he has more than enough method and reason to find the people that Peter loves and crush them before his very eyes for preventing him from getting back that which he himself loved. But that can come later. Not yet, not now. Norman leaves, and Peter is left shaken by the whole experience. In the aftermath, Peter is comforted by his friends, and it is here where we learn more about the growing dynamics between them. In particular, the friendship between Peter, Ochako, and Izuku. Peter and Ochako would end up becoming good friends, not love interests, though. Izuwacha is one of my favorite ships, and I have no intent on breaking that up, even developing something close to a sibling-like relationship. And Ochako would remain as Izuku's best friend. But no matter how much the two of them tried, Izuku and Peter's relationship would remain frosty and distant due to Izuku's growing feelings of inadequacy when compared to the latter. Peter would remain unaware of why Izuku is acting like this, as he would keep these thoughts to himself. But Izuku would seek to keep his distance. These feelings of his are only made worse around Ada, who is still holding resentment for Peter stopping him from taking down Stain, as well as the voice in Izuku's head, something within One for All, showing more care for Peter than it does for Izuku, meaning that All Might's own quirk doesn't want him. Not only that, but many of Peter's classmates, and even Inko and Kimia in private, are beginning to compare the web crawler to All Might himself. And All Might himself has taken a clear interest in Peter himself, but for reasons that Izuku doesn't know, worsening his feelings of inferiority. Soon enough, the summer training camp would begin, and Peter and his friends would lead the others out of the forest, using their superior experience to best the monsters that the wild pussycats, particularly Pixie Bob, threw at them. Soon enough, Peter would meet Koda, and he and Momo would try to talk to him about his problems, only for Koda to rebuff them. Peter and Momo would relent, but offered to be there if Koda ever needed it. Later on, Peter would soon wander off on his own, and would come across Felicia, who had tailed them all the way from UA to the campgrounds and the forest. Peter would be confused as to why Felicia was there, but she would simply reply that she was bored, though Peter couldn't find it in himself to believe her. The two of them would strike up a conversation, and Peter would reveal his frustrations with the restrictions of Hero Society, as well as its emphasis on popularity and rankings, and would express a desire to return to how he used to operate, despite him knowing the problems that it would cause for him. It is here that Felicia reveals that she was the one that had been sending the anonymous donations to Feast, and had done it through stealing and selling things that she had stolen from several corrupt heroes. Peter is disappointed, but not surprised, that Felicia has gone back to her thieving ways, but doesn't have much time to react, as the League of Villains attack the summer camp, and the two of them are forced into action. Peter and Momo meet up as Felicia vanishes in the fighting, and they find the villain Muscular antagonizing and about to kill Koda. Peter and Momo move to stop him, but Momo realizes that they haven't been given any permission to fight back against the villains, seeing as their students, and the two of them are forced to flee the villain with Koda, much to Peter's frustration. Meanwhile, The other students of Class 1A and B are engaged by the villains. Aizawa goes up against Dabai, whilst Ochako and Tsuyu are pitted against the psychotic blood spider again, Toga, and are barely keeping up. Meanwhile, Kendo and Zero are pitted against Moonfish, who are able to dodge his tooth quirk thanks to their unique training with Peter and the rest of their friends, whilst Mustard spends his time hunting down Aoyama and an incapacitated Hagakure, and Spinner battles against Shoji and Ida. The rest of the Sinister Six, however, are taking the few heroes that are there, as well as the rest of the students, to shop. Mysterio has locked the wild pussycats in a hallucinogenic illusion. Scorpion is picking off as many students as he can, poisoning them one by one and leaving them catatonic and barely alive. Kaminari tries to use his super move on Electro, only for it to turn against him and give Electro more power. Midoriya is barely able to hold his own against a rampaging Rhino, and Bakugo and Todoroki are forced to run from Vulture as he circles above them on the hunt. All of this is made worse when Takoyami's quirk, Dark Shadow, reacts badly to the dark and goes on a rampage. Essentially, it's hell for the students and heroes, who are barely able to hold off the villains. The only good thing that they have going for them is Felicia running interference for the heroes and going toe-to-toe with the Sinister Six thanks to her previous experience with them. If it hasn't already become clear, one of the biggest running threads in this story is experience, and how that affects you. As in the battles of this story, it's always the ones with the most experience in fights that always come out on top, not those that are only just starting. Eventually, Peter decides that enough is enough, and moves to confront Muscular. Momo is angst at this, as 1. They haven't been given permission to attack the villains, and could go to prison for using their quirks against them, and 2. Muscular is a registered serial killer, and could very well kill Peter. However, Peter doesn't care and sends Momo and Koda away to safety, and Momo finally pushes past her hesitation and hides Koda away, before running back to join Peter in taking down Muscular. The fight between the two parties is long and difficult, with both sides receiving a deluge of injuries each, but eventually, Peter and Momo are able to defeat Muscular and knock him out cold. However, the two of them are left critically injured, with shattered bones and bleeding bodies, and they are forced to limp their way to safety, where they run into the Green Goblin, who calls off the rest of the villains, both his Sinister Six and the League villains, and tells Peter that he will call off his villains if he comes with them. Peter is reluctant to do this, not believing that the others will not come to harm. But that is when Goblin reveals something to Peter. Felicia had led the villains to the camp. Felicia appears next to Peter, and when he confronts her about this, she guiltily says that it's the truth, but only because he had been holding someone hostage and threatened to kill them if she didn't comply. She was a thief, but she wasn't a murderer. And besides, it was someone important to her, and even more so to Peter. With a sick smile, Goblin opens up a portal and plucks out a tied-up Aunt May, who Osborn had pulled out of their home universe like Kimia and Felicia herself. Peter is horrified by this, and Goblin says that unless Peter comes with them, May will die slowly and painfully. Peter would reluctantly agree and surrender to Goblin. Goblin would take Peter away, but not before having Scorpion knock him out via poisoning him. At the same time, whilst the villains, even the League's men aside from the unconscious Muscular, are retreating, without Bakugo in hand as Goblin's way of spiting both Shigaraki and All for One, Scorpion would then go on to stab and poison Felicia, both as a petty spite against Spider-Man and to ensure that she dies without ever revealing where the League's main headquarters are. This arc would begin right as the last one ends, with the League of Villains and Sinister Six leaving the summer training camp and forcing the still capable students, the ones who are still standing, to gather up all their incapacitated classmates and try to stop Felicia from dying of poisoning. Thankfully, Momo remembers that Peter had borrowed Momo once to help him, and Hatsune Momo and Hatsune herself had got off on a rocky start thanks to Hatsune wanting to use Momo as a way to make more of her babies. But Momo had eventually got it into her head that Momo didn't like being treated that way, and the two of them had become friends soon after figure out some chemical compositions, and was told that they had been working on an antidote to Scorpion's poisons, including on how to nullify its lethal effects, and calls Hatsum to see if that antidote was ever completed. To her eternal happiness, Hatsum had completed it, and when the poisoned students, as well as Felicia, arrive at the hospital, they are able to mass-produce the antidote and administer it to them, nullifying the poison and saving Felicia's life. Meanwhile, Peter wakes up from unconsciousness, drifting in and out of consciousness from the poison, tied to a chair and with metal restraints holding him down, and comes forth to an argument between Shigaraki, All for One, and Goblin, who admits to having neglected to pick up Bakugo out of spite of All for One holding him back from completing his goals earlier in their partnership. Shigaraki, in a rage, would try to kill Peter in retaliation, only for Goblin to hold him back and order him to stand down. It was Goblin's turn to call the shots, not Shigaraki or All for One. He wasn't going to be taking orders from them anymore. Peter slips back into unconsciousness. At UI, the heroes gather and consider what to do now. At first, immediate punishment on Felicia for her part in the attack is demanded, but are put under consideration when several of the students, especially both Peter's friends and the ones that she helped save from the villains back in the forest, speak up in her defense, much to their confusion. As such, that problem is put on the back burner whilst they figure out how to retaliate against the villains. Luckily, they have a breakthrough, as Felicia is conscious again, and has revealed to the heroes where the League and Six are based, and how she had been able to sneak a tracker onto Scorpion whilst he was stabbing and poisoning her. Back with Peter, he wakes up once again, and is put face to face with Goblin once more. The two of them have a talk that they should have had a long time ago. Goblin reveals how far his hatred for Spider-Man, and by extension Peter, runs, made worse by the fact that he had once considered Peter to be a son to him, which only makes the supposed betrayal even worse. Now, he blames Peter for everything that's happened to him, especially Harry, and even Emily's deaths, and Peter shoots back that everything that happened to Goblin was because of Goblin himself, not Peter, nor anyone else. It is during this conversation that we get the reveal that Oscorp, before it went under thanks to Norman Osborn's crimes, had been the one to create the radioactive spider that bit Peter and turned him into the hero that he was today. Worse yet, Peter's childhood friend, outside of Harry, was Gwen Stacy, and Green Goblin had killed her during one of his attacks on the city, worsening the mutual hatred between them. Finally, Peter asks what Goblin wants with the Infinity Stones, and Goblin makes his intentions here. He wants to bring his wife and son back to life. Peter is shocked by this, and Goblin explains that he seeks to bring back everything that he has loved, and the things that he loved the most were his wife, Emily, and his son, Harry. As such, when he gains all 4 stones, he will use them to bring back his wife and son with just a snap of his fingers, and he can go back to being a family with them. But when Peter says that he could have helped him with bringing Emily and Harry back, Goblin sneers at him for it. His hatred and resentment of Spider-Man runs way too deep for him to even consider it. Worse yet, Goblin is either unable or unwilling to accept that he was horrifically abusive and neglectful to his son after his wife's death, and refuses to accept that the two of them would utterly despise Norman for what he has done, to Harry, to Peter, and to everyone else. Goblin leaves, and allows the rest of the Sinister Six move in to have their own fun with their most hated nemesis. And thus would begin the long torture of Peter Parker. Back in the hospital, Felicia and Momo talk with each other, where Felicia reveals her own past, in that she had been raised in poverty alongside her father, Walter Hardy, who had trained her to become a cat burglar in order to steal the food they needed to survive, and then the items that they needed to sell to make money. Then it just kept going on and on and on, until eventually, when she was 14 years old, she was breaking into rich people's homes and stealing their stuff right out from under their nose. By the time that she had come across Spider-Man, She had lost her father to a police officer who had shot him in the head for stealing for someone he was on the payroll for, solidifying Felicia's hatred of authority. Felicia didn't hate her father. In fact, she had loved him, much to Momo's surprise. He wasn't abusive, but they had to make do in a world that wasn't willing to give them a chance. She had had no choice in breaking the law. It was simply the circumstances that she was born into. However, when she finally met Spider-Man, she had found within him a friend, and maybe even something more. She had found in him a fragment of a happy childhood that she had never had. When Harry Osborn, one of Peter's childhood friends, had died, Felicia and Gwen Stacy, Peter's other childhood friend, had been there to comfort Peter over the loss, just as Peter had been there to comfort Felicia over the death of her father. And then, when Gwen died to Green Goblin sometime later, Felicia had helped him through the loss. The two of them had got into a brief romantic relationship with each other, but neither of them were emotionally mature enough to maintain it. And Peter was still mourning the loss of Harry and Gwen, and too consumed by grief to be able to cope with being with another. It was too soon after Gwen's death, the loss of the first woman that he loved, and the two of them mutually ended it, thankfully still being friends afterwards, if on a strange basis of one being a vigilante and the other being the thief they were supposed to catch. Momo is stunned by this story and conflicted on what she is supposed to think about it. She has always been taught that villains are people that do heinous things just because they want to, and that heroes are, well, heroic because they stop the villains, and nothing more. That was what everyone who was born into hero society was taught. But she had never considered the possibility that someone may be forced to become a villain because they had no choice. Then, she remembers all the former and reformed villains that work in and attend Feast, including twice, Mr. Compress, and Gentle Criminal and La Brava, and would begin to wonder as to what else hero society had neglected to teach them. But that would have to wait, as all the able-bodied students, or at least the ones not still in bed due to injuries or recovering from Scorpion's poison, gather around Momo and Felicia's beds and discuss what to do next. Many of them consider staying put and waiting for the heroes to rescue Peter. However, several other students, and Felicia, counter that the Sinister Six hate Spider-Man with a passion, and will no doubt be taking out that hate on him right now. They won't kill him, at least not until they've made him suffer. But with Aunt May there, they might have killed her already just to make a point to him. If they needed to move, then they needed to do it now. Plus, they might be planning on moving him out of the hideout, meaning that if they don't act soon, they might have ditched their current location and moved on, and Peter would be lost to them forever. As such, Felicia frees herself from her restraints without much efforts, and makes plans to infiltrate the Sinister Six's hideout and rescue Peter and May, seeing as even with All Might there, the pro-heroes have no idea what they're walking into and might not be able to get him out themselves. Plus, she'd managed to sneak another, more hidden tracker onto Scorpion, meaning that if they did move on, they could follow him and the rest of the League back to their next location if they find the first tracking device. Some of them agree to go with her, mainly Kendo, Tetsutetsu, Kirishima, Todoroki, Ochako, and Izuku. He might have a frosty relationship with Peter, but he's still Izuku, and he still wants to save as many people as he can. Momo would wish to go with them, but her injuries would keep her bedridden. However, the rest of the students would be unwilling to go, particularly Tsuyu, who would point out that this plan was super illegal and would get them all into trouble and considered villains themselves. And Ida, who would be completely against this plan, his bias against Peter not helping, as he points out that this would make them all vigilantes, and that associating with a criminal like Felicia would only make things worse for everyone as well. Soon enough, the able-bodied students, few as they were, would go back to attend to their bedridden friends, while the rescue squad would be provided walkie-talkies by Momo, and would get on their way. However, Ida would end up tailing behind them, wanting to stop them from going too far before they get themselves into trouble that they can't get out of. Meanwhile, Peter is in excruciating agony from the torture, that the Sinister Six has put him under. He's been poisoned by Scorpion and sent into violent hallucination after hallucination of his friends and family angry at him, berating him, mocking him for his failures. He's been electrocuted by Electro, burning his skin and almost giving him a heart attack several times. He's had his bones cracked and crushed from punch after punch from Rhino. He's had his skin stabbed, sliced, and cut open by Vulture. And now, he was recovering from the effects of Mysterio's illusions, of Harry, Gwen, and Uncle Ben standing above him, asking him over and over again why he had let them die. Peter is left a sobbing mess, and is left in the company of Aunt May, who provides as much comfort as she can to him as he recovers from everything that he's been through, even as she is still overcome with confusion with the situation that she is in. May eventually reveals that she already knew that Peter was Spider-Man, and Peter is left to simply cry in both agony from the pain and relief that he didn't have to hide it from her anymore. However, the monitor in their room would activate to reveal All for One, who would attempt to manipulate Peter into joining him via voicing all of Peter's problems and frustrations with Hero Society, and would express interest in taking his supposed quirk. Peter, despite being injured to the point of possible delirium, would begin to probe All for One himself, trying to figure out his plans and why he is doing all of this, but is horrified to realize that not only is All for One committing evil for nothing more than its own sake, but he is somehow psychologically incapable of understanding the basic concept of good. He's not a sociopath or even a psychopath, as they can at least feel, acknowledge, or understand the concept of love and empathy. All for One is something entirely more twisted. At least all the villains that he fought had some bigger motivation for wanting to commit villainy, many of which he could understand and even sympathize with at times if they weren't murdering people. All for One had murdered so many people and terrorized countless more for no other reason than just for its own sake, just because he felt like it. And that made him beyond any kind of redemption in Peter's mind. All for One was a hollow, empty person who committed evil for nothing more than evil's sake, with not even a motivation or reason for him to do so beyond wanting to be evil. And that made him a bigger monster than any of the villains that Peter had ever faced. However, a possible boon comes to Peter when All for One talks about the stones that Green Goblin has in his possession, and dismisses them as if they are nothing, despite having seen the nearly limitless power of the Space Stone and Reality Stone numerous times, including how they had allowed Goblin to pull people into different realities. Upon hearing this, Peter realizes that not only is All for One was incapable of understanding good, but he is so absorbed in his quirks that he cannot acknowledge any power outside of them, meaning that he is psychologically incapable of recognizing and accepting the Infinity Stones as a power equal or even greater than a quirk. Soon enough, All for One disconnects from the call, leaving Peter and May on their own, just as the former is on the brink of death. Meanwhile, Felicia would lead her group to the Sinister Six's hideout alongside the pro-heroes in secret, grabbing them some disguises along the way, many of which would be reminiscent of different spider people in a meta sense. Ochako would dress herself up in something similar to Teresa Parker, whilst Kirishima and Tetsutetsu would take up hoodies and jeans similar to Ben Reilly. Kendo, meanwhile, would wear something similar to Julia Carpenter, that being a red coat, tracksuits, and glasses, and Midoriya would end up wearing a black hoodie and trouser pair. Soon enough, they were on the move and heading for Kamino. Back in the League and Six's hideout, the two main factions would busy themselves with squabbling with each other. However, when Goblin looks to the TV and sees the interview taking place regarding Yue and Peter's kidnapping, who they still refer to as Spider-Man, in order to protect his identity, Goblin quickly realizes that this is a ruse and orders Kurogiri to transport them all, including Peter and May, to their secondary hideout. Despite being subordinate to Shigaraki and not Goblin, Kurogiri is forced to obey. Worse yet, Scorpion discovers the first tracker on him and disregards it, leaving it in the bar for the heroes to find. Soon enough, Felicia's group find that the second tracker recording Scorpion's location has changed from one side of Kamino to the other, and they move to intercept. Izuku, meanwhile, calls up All Might and reveals what has happened, speculating that the heroes may be walking into a trap. But whilst All Might takes this into consideration, Eraserhead, who has been listening to their conversation, expresses his disappointment at the young heroes for going after Peter. But they deny being with Felicia when he asks, explaining that she had escaped on her own. Soon enough, the heroes raid the bar hideout where the first tracker was leading them, only for them to realize that it has been filled with bombs. Several heroes are wounded in the ensuing blast, and All Might realizes that the children are heading right for an assembled fighting force that they will stand no chance against. Radioing Izuku once more, he tracks their signal right to the other end of the city and moves to join them, an army of heroes behind them. Meanwhile, Felicia's group makes it to the other hideout and discover that it is a factory of Namu, including the ones that would have been deployed to the forest if not for the Sinister Six being there. Nearby, the group find the Sinister Six and League of Villains, all with a captive Peter and May in tow, the latter of whom they plan to use as a hostage, and the former they plan to take away to finally kill a slow and painful death. However, just before they can make a move, Ida, wearing a disguise resembling that of the Punisher, corners and stops them, preventing them from going any further, as to go against the villains now would be breaking the law and would make them all villains as well. However, because of his previous vendetta against Peter, he poorly chooses his words and makes the other students seem like he wanted to leave Peter to die. This argument only serves to alert the villains to their location, and soon enough the students are forced to scatter and run as the Sinister Six and League of Villains split up to hunt them down. All the while Goblin and Shigaraki argue about what to do next, with Shigaraki wanting to just kill Peter and May and be done with them, and Goblin wanting to take them with, both as hostages and as playthings. However, soon enough, All Might and the rest of the heroes arrive, and they begin to do battle with the Sinister Six and the League of Villains. However, this time, because All Might has received advanced warning that All for One has returned, he comes equipped with a special set of power armor that he had commissioned from my island before David was turned into the lizard, which he names as the Villain Buster. Of course, soon enough, All for One arrives to do battle with All Might and drop his bombshell about Tamira being Nana's grandson, and the two of them to battle. However, this battle is complicated by the Green Goblin joining the fight against All Might, and he begins to use the Infinity Gauntlet to beat down on the hero alongside All for One, turning the fight against the number one hero. At the same time, Shigaraki is left to babysit May and Peter, and decides that he has had enough of Goblin telling him what to do, and decides to do away with the two of them by just killing them. However, before he can, Black Cat and Izuku are able to catch him and knock him out of the fight, allowing them to rescue May and Peter and pull them away. Unfortunately, Peter is in no condition to move, as he is too wounded and losing way too much blood. Peter is on the verge of death from the constant torture that he has been under, and all that Felicia, Aunt May, and Izuku can do is beg for him to stay with them, as he slowly begins to slip away, the life leaving his body. And that is when One for All, the quirk inside of Izuku that had once been symbiotically linked to him, makes its move, finally rejecting Izuku as its holder and moving on to its preferred host. One for All ejects itself from the green-haired boy and emerges as a viscous black goo, transferring over to Peter and covering him in a black suit with white eyes and a white spider logo extending from his front to his back. One for All is this universe's version of the symbiote, and it has just bestowed onto Peter his iconic black suit. Upon being covered in the black suit, which has symbiotically linked to him, now hence his nicknaming of it being a symbiote, and is rapidly healing his wounds, Peter immediate gets up and ushers Felicia, May, and a depowered Izuku away, and jumps back into the fight. Peter, now Spider-Man once again, would throw himself against most of the Sinister Six, with the only exclusion being Goblin, and with his new suit and the enhanced strength and powers that it gives him, He proceeds to completely wipe the floor with all 5 of them and leave them in the dirt, before zipping around to help the other students and heroes with taking down the villains, all of them, including himself, amazed at the strength and power of his new suit, before moving on to assist All Might in taking down All for One and the Green Goblin. In the ensuing battle, All for One would be defeated and captured by All Might, helped by his new Villain Buster suit in making sure that he didn't suffer from the same injuries as in canon. But not before All for One sent the rest of the League of Villains away, save for the Green Goblin and his Sinister Six as retribution for Goblin's previous betrayal. Soon enough, Goblin would be beaten by the new black-suited Spider-Man and lose his Infinity Gauntlet, forced to go on the run and abandon his minions to the heroes. The heroes would come out of this day with an almost total win, save for the injured heroes and the League of Villains escaping. The Namu warehouse would be raided and occupied, and all the Namu inside incarcerated, alongside 5 of the Sinister Six who had been taken out by Spider-Man, that being Vulture, Electro, Mysterio, Rhino, and Scorpion. Spider-Man's injuries would be healed by the symbiote suit, now having been fully bonded to him, and everyone would be amazed by his newfound strength and power thanks to it. Peter would thank Izuku for lending him his power, but Izuku would remain silent on the matter. Before Peter can question Izuku further on the matter, though, Aizawa would approach the gathering of students, including Peter, and express his anger and disappointment at the students for running off to try and rescue Peter, for going against the heroes, acting as vigilantes, breaking the law, and going up against villains who would have killed them without any hesitation. All of this is enough for him to not only expel them, but have them all arrested as well, especially for working with a known criminal like Felicia Hardy. And then he does. He expels them all. However, before he can then hand them off to the police, a woman, just a few years older than Peter himself, would walk onto the field, flanked by the number 2 hero Endeavor, and 2 guards wearing the colors of the Japanese Diet, the ruling governmental body of Japan. She is Adriana Anasoria, the youngest woman to ever work for the Japanese Diet. Aizawa is about to say something to her, but Adriana ignores him and goes right for Peter, sending him a smile and shaking his hand, thanking the young hero for taking down the Sinister Six and saving many lives on this day. She says to him that she likes his new black suit, and would also encourage him to keep it, saying that it looks good on him. However, Peter would only respond awkwardly to her, cautious of this strange woman who seemed way too young to be in politics of government offices of any kind. Aizawa would demand to know why Adriana is here, and she simply replies that she wished to congratulate them on a job well done. UA must be teaching its students well. That must have been what Aizawa was talking to them about, of course. It would be the height of stupidity to punish them for simply acting like the heroes that they were. Aizawa recognizes the jab, and responds that how he punishes his students, or rather, his ex-students, is up to him. Adriana retorts by asking if that was so, and commenting that teachers usually have to answer to a set of rules when doling out punishments to their students, and that it wasn't up to a teacher alone to decide that. She'd had to start consulting UA to find out if that was the truth. But then again, if Aizawa didn't want them, then she could always just pick them up and take them under her wing instead. Aizawa recognizes the threat in both those comments and is forced to back off. And Adriana makes a comment about hoping to see them on their work studies soon enough. Another hidden threat, only this time Aizawa doesn't budge on his stance, and demands to know from the students where Felicia Hardy is. Adriana simply asks who, and the students, recognizing her cover, go along with it, as Felicia Hardy slipped away the moment that Peter and the heroes won the battle. Angered, but forced to keep it to himself, Aizawa orders his former students home, promising that there would be consequences for this. Adriana smiles and directs that threat to their enemies another veiled threat, and walks with the students off back to Feast, where they go to rest after a long night. Along the way, she congratulates them on their efforts, and says that even if UA expels them, they will always have a possible future in the Japanese Diet, and promises to wipe the black mark from their records, protecting their futures. Peter and the student, however, are unsure of how to really process all of this, as they have all just been expelled from UA, and their former teacher would have had them all arrested for trying to help their friend. This has left them all rattled and demoralized, Ida especially, and Peter apologizes profusely for having forced them all to be kicked out. But the students are quick to point out that it's their attempt to rescue Peter, their friend, that they don't regret. If they had been given the chance to do it all over again, they'd take it in a heartbeat, regardless of the consequences. And yet, despite Adriana's support for them, the consequences of their actions are finally hitting them. The next morning, in the aftermath of the battle, the students gather around Peter and watch him flex off his newfound strength in between tending to Aunt May and treating each other's injuries, in an effort to try and take their minds off of their expulsion from UA. Peter is amazed by his new black suit and the symbiote One for All that made it, and asks Izuku why he has never done anything like this with his quirk before. Izuku comments that his quirk has never done that before for him. It should be noted that previously, his hero costume has had certain elements added to it that resemble Agent Venom, and Peter asks if he could try to do it now. Izuku says that he can't, and the others wonder why. Izuku then says that he wasn't born with his quirk, it was given to him. And now it has given itself over to Peter. Izuku Midoriya is quirkless once again. The students are shocked by this, and in a state of panic at essentially stealing his friend's quirk. Peter tries to return the suit to Izuku, only for it to reject Izuku and stick to Peter. Izuku says that One for All has rejected him and given itself over to Peter. It's chosen Spider-Man over Deku and wants to stay with him. Peter, not happy about taking Izuku's quirk away from him, asks who gave it to him, and Izuku is hesitant to say. However, that's when All Might shows up to see if they are well and to express his apologies for them being removed from UA. And when they give the affirmative and explain what is happening, he informs them that he was the one who gave Izuku One for All, and that it has never rejected a candidate before, at least as far as he knows. Realizing that David Shield, aka the Lizard, is one of the few people that All Might trusts with the secret of One for All, is possibly the only one smart enough to figure out what is going on. They resolve to continue their search for him. Back in UA, the teachers gather to discuss what to do and where to go next. All Might is rattled by his conversation with Peter and the students concerning One for All and how it rejected Izuku, which shows during his meeting. Aizawa, however, is furious at the students for breaking the rules and almost getting themselves killed against villains that they stood no chance against. Unfortunately for him, Nezu says that his hands are tied. For years, the Japanese Diet has been willingly keeping its hands out of UA's business thanks to several changes in policies and staff. However, now they are finally beginning to interfere with UA's regulations and affairs, and are actively preventing Peter and the students that went to Camino from being punished. Aizawa guesses that Adriana is the one behind the interferences, to which the majority of the staff, save for Nezu, respond with confusion. Adriana has been a shadowy figure in the Japanese Diet, never sticking out or staying too long in the spotlight, despite her being so young when compared to everyone else that worked with the organization. As such, there was hardly any information on her to build a profile with, not even a criminal record, which meant that there was no way for them to predict what she is going to do next. Nezu and the others are suspicious of how Adriana could have any pull over the Diet, as well as any other governmental bodies and agencies, such as the HPSC, but resolve to resist any negative policies and prevent them from influencing their students. But then, All Might tells them that, because his successor, Izuku, is no longer allowed within UA's premises, and with All for One defeated and behind bars, his preparedness and villain-buster armor means that he does not suffer the same career-ending injuries as in canon, that he no longer has any logical reason to stay in UA, as he would no longer be able to train his successor in doing so, and hands in his resignation, to the shock of many. Except for Aizawa. He's just happy that All Might's gone. He didn't need him encouraging reckless thoughts of vigilantism in his students anymore. Just like Peter Parker. Though he was confused as to why it seemed like Peter Parker himself didn't have any records or information available to him until 10 months before his coming to UA. When his vigilante career began, and also when sightings of his villains had begun as well. It was suspicious, to say the least. In response to this, Aizawa begins his own investigation into Spider-Man and the events surrounding him, specifically to do with his involvement with the Sinister Six and the Green Goblin, and how said villain seemed to have multiple powers thanks to the glove that he wore. At first, he suspects that the glove is a simple conduit for his quirk, only to begin investigating the incident on Island as it connects to Peter, only to firstly find that the information that he needed was restricted by both All Might and Naomasa, as well as a seal from someone in the government, whom he suspects to be Adriana. However, he is soon called away by the authorities to help on a case, as one of the Sinister Six's former villains, a portal user by the moniker of Spot, who was able to escape from prison thanks to his spots, has been using his powers to rob banks across the country, and he is to use his quirk to disable Spot and leave him open for arrest. But when he arrives just as the heroes catch the Spot in their trap, and when he uses his quirk on the villain, the Spot simply tells him that he's weird for staring at him so intensely, and then jumps through a portal and leaves. Aizawa is shocked by this, and riddled with confusion, as his quirk has always worked in erasing other people's quirks, and for it to work now, it would mean that the Spot has powers that exist outside of quirks. Refusing to believe this, Aizawa continues to look into Spider-Man and his activities, as well as those of his former students' many enemies. During his investigation, he learns that the likes of Scorpion, Vulture, and Rhino don't have quirks themselves, are simply dressed in augmented, technologically advanced exosuits. His suspicions of Spider-Man only begin to increase. Soon enough, Aizawa would come across another trap to capture Spot once more, and once again, his quirk would prove to be less than effective. He would be forced to call upon assistance in the form of Present Mike and Midnight to help him take down this villain. Eventually, they would be able to stop the villain via using Present Mike's quirk to disorientate him before turning his spots against him by Midnight, throwing her knockout gas through Spot's portals and incapacitate him, leaving him open to arrest. In the interrogation room, Aizawa joins in with the interrogator in talking to the Spot, who has been wrapped up in dozens of chains and quirk-suppressing cuffs. When Aizawa demands to know how he was able to avoid being affected by his quirk, the Spot simply shrugs and states that he has no idea what he is talking about, and that his power wasn't because of a quirk. His home dimension didn't have quirks. Then, using his spots once more, Spot slips out of the quirk-suppressing cuffs and escapes, leaving behind a shaken Aizawa, unsure and unable to understand what is going on. Later, Aizawa realizes that he is still being kept away from the information that he needs to complete his investigation. As such, he is forced to sneak around and use favors to get the information that he needs. And when he does, he learns that the villain known as Wolfram had used a stone similar to the ones in Goblin's Gauntlet to gain power, leading him to realize that there is power outside of quirks, shattering much of his worldview around hero society, and increasing his paranoia. But later on, Aizawa is called into a meeting with a member of the Japanese Diet, that being Adriana Soria. The two talk for a while, with Aizawa being confused as to why he was called to her office, only for him to realize for himself. Adriana knows that he's looking into Spider-Man, his enemies, and the Infinity Gems, and is subtly threatening him into silence. Aizawa, at first, is unintimidated by the threat, only to be cowed once Adriana brings up Yue, and how Nezu has been unwilling to listen to the suggestions made by members of the Diet, and how there might need to be a change of leadership soon enough. Then, she makes a comment about the students, and wonders if she should start looking to recruit from their ranks early. as she had reason to suspect that what is being taught to them might not be up to snuff. She makes a comment that someone might be trying to cow their heroic instincts, which angers Aizawa. But he chooses not to say anything about it. Then, Adriana states that she'd hate for any of his students to end up like Shirakumo, Aizawa's old friend, and he very nearly loses his cool. Demanding to know what the hell Adriana wants, she makes her stance clear. She knows that he's looking into Spider-Man and demands that he ceases, as he does not have any clearance to look into him, and she already has people committed to this investigation. Aizawa makes it clear that Peter Parker, by principle alone, is a danger to his students due to his vigilante ways and ideology, as it goes against everything that hero society values, and it is within his right to investigate him, especially when it comes to possible powers that may harm his students. Adriana simply comments that Spider-Man is no longer a threat, and as such is no longer Aizawa's problem or concern. Then, she restates her demand and point, and makes it clear that, if he doesn't, it won't be Aizawa that faces the consequences of his actions. Despite himself, Aizawa feels a compulsion to do what she says, like an aroma in the air, and leaves. Heading home, he finds that all the data and information that he has collected on Spider-Man and everything that has happened around him were gone, completely erased from his computers, and even the physical copies that he'd made had disappeared as well. Aizawa's paranoia begins to grow, and he realizes that, with Adriana's growing influence, his students are now at risk. Determined to stop the possible thoughts of vigilantism that still linger within them, as well as keep them safe and strong for whatever may come in the future, Aizawa makes it his mission to do what he couldn't do for Shirakumo, and make them the strongest, best heroes that they can be, no matter how much it hurts them. Several days after the Camino incident, the remaining students of Class 1A and B, including Momo and Hatsune, all now having healed from the mass poisonings and injuries, meet up outside of UA with Peter and his friends at Feast, and discuss what to do next. The various members of the Future Foundation, both the ones in and out of UA, would agree to continue their operations with Feast, and plan to carry on as normal. However, others counter that nothing for them can be the same anymore, especially with Peter's friends sneaking out and joining up with a known criminal in an act that was clearly vigilantism, and now being kicked out of UA for it, putting all of their futures in danger, if not for Feast and the Future Foundation's connections, as well as the support of Adriana. They're lucky as it is that they're not all in prison. Ida is the one to spearhead this line of thinking. His unresolved bitterness over Stain would only grow with the anger, shame, and humiliation of being expelled from UA, especially when he had never even intended on getting involved for fighting the villains to begin with. Even the comforting words of his friends would provide no medicine for his anger. As such, he begins to take it out on Peter, and anyone who would go against the law, such as those who went to go after Peter, and those who knew about their attempt but didn't do anything about it. Worse yet, his thoughts would begin to darken as well, as he wonders why Peter didn't just kill his villains and be done with it when they had the chance. He ends up sparking an argument within the group and leaves at its end, forcing the rest of the gathering to break up and go their own separate ways, left to ruminate over what they are supposed to do now. But unfortunately, they wouldn't have long to think about this, as a new threat finally rears its head. Kraven the Hunter, now with an army of hunters made up of the thugs and mercenaries who would have been in the Ustjin canon, but now highly trained and armed with all sorts of weapons, has taken advantage of the chaos around the aftermath of the Camino incident, and had begun a new hunt across the entirety of Japan. Kraven is dying. He has been diagnosed with a neurodegenerative disease that is slowly eating away at him from the inside, and he has decided that he would rather die on his feet and in the thrill of a hunt rather than die in his sight. This would be Kraven's last hunt, and it would only end when he had the head of this world's strongest warrior, or when one who was worthy of his life would grant him an equally worthy death. Soon enough, Kraven would hijack the local news station, announcing his intent to the world and his declaration to fulfill his final hunt and be felled by whomever was worthy enough to be his killer. And he goes on to invite everyone and anyone to try. Not too long after, Kraven's hunters spread out across the city and begin several bloody strings of brutal murders on all sorts of powerful quirk users, hunting down and killing heroes, villains, and civilians alike, all in the name of finding more and more prey to take as trophies, and to find the perfect death as well. During all of this, Peter and his friends would be forced to lock themselves away within Feast, unsure of whether they should be intervening against Kraven and his hunters in the wake of everything that happened in Camino, and their being expelled from Ua. Peter would be the most torn about this, as he knows how dangerous Kraven truly is, but cannot help but ponder the consequences that would befall his friends if he was to go out and try to track him down once more. It wasn't like any of them had a choice in the matter anymore, as several pro-heroes would be placed around their homes and Feast, making sure that all of their movements are monitored and that they don't go off on a vigilante spree again. Essentially, they were prisoners within their own homes. Meanwhile, All Might and many of the top pro-heroes would be sent out against Kraven's hunters. But even without his canon career-ending injuries and his villain-buster suit, he is still injured from the battle, and is demoralized from his successor being kicked from Ua and losing his quirk, and thereby his own leaving of Ua. But even with that, he tries his best to take down the hunters. But Kraven and his goons would outsmart him every step of the way. Kraven himself enjoying the idea of confronting All Might, and either ending his life or being ended by the number one hero. Soon enough, Kraven and his goons would finally confront All Might. And despite his strength and power, despite his years of experience in fighting villains of all walks of life, All Might would be defeated by Kraven, who used tricks, traps, and his cunning to defeat the number one hero. The main reason for him being able to do this: All Might has decades of experience with fighting people, and as such always subconsciously pulls his punches. Kraven has decades of experience with killing them, and does not hold back his strength at all. When Kraven confronts All Might in his deflated form, he is not pleased with this hunt, but is enraged that someone who is so mortally wounded, as in missing half his stomach and with mangled organs, could think themselves worthy of facing him when they are not at full strength, and deems him not worthy of killing, leaving All Might behind to recover in shame. Soon enough, Kraven begins to bring more people into his pack of hunters, including the likes of the Volcano Thieves and Curator and Bearhead of the Wild Villains, all with a particular vendetta against Spiderman. Even worse, he orchestrates a massive prison escape of all of Spider-Man's minor villains, the likes of the Sinister Six, save for the uncaptured Green Goblin, had been thrown into Tartarus and several others. But instead of setting them all free, he would have them all captured by his hunters for his own purposes, all for the sake of his final hunt. Meanwhile, Peter would start to become antsy and desperate to try and defeat Kraven, especially when he hears of the prison breakout and subsequent deaths and disappearances of several heroes and civilians. However, he continuously finds his hands tied by the heroes, who are eager to stop him from running off and going vigilante once again. Worse yet, several heroes have begun to threaten FEAST's operations, threatening to arrest the former villains and anyone else sheltering inside, and mocking the ex-students for being removed from UA. This greatly demoralizes the former students, and leaves them without much of a future left for them, despite what their friends say. Worst of all the ex-students is Ida, who's been left in a very dark place in the wake of his brother's death, and his lack of resolution to his anger over Stain's death. His family agency has disbanded due to both Tensei's death and his expulsion from UA, since the former was the driving force behind the agency in its modern day, and the latter because such an expulsion was a black mark against the Ida family's pride, meaning that they couldn't have him take up the family mantle and inherit the agency. And as such there was no longer a reason to keep it together if he could no longer become a hero. As such, Ida is now considered the black sheep of the family, and has left him with next to no people in his family to talk to and express his darkening thoughts and growing anger. His friends would try to talk to him about it, seeing how his rage and directionless need for revenge is beginning to consume him. But he just cuts them off and out of his life, wanting to be on his own now. Unfortunately, Ida would not have much time left to ruminate on their thoughts, nor would Peter or the other ex-students. Feast would be attacked by the hunters and soaked in sleeping gas, as would the ex-students in their homes, and other heroes and villains alike. And they are all kidnapped by the villains. All for the sake of the greatest hunt that the world has ever seen. Soon, Peter and his friends, from ex-students Ochako and Kirishima and Feast, proper students like Momo and Hatsum and Yua, and Ida out in the wild and Kimiya, the civilian, to even his ex-villain allies like Gentle, La Brava, and twice from Feast and former vigilantes like Kazuko, would wake up. And while Peter's new symbiote suit would form around himself to make him Spider-Man once more, the others would find themselves dressed in their costumes and in battle garb, much like all the others that were waking up around them. From pro-heroes like Mirko and Ruiku to villains such as Kendo Rappa and Innsmouth's crew. From familiar foes such as Lady Beetle and Tarantula, to new faces like Panda Mania, Gibbon, and the Lobo brothers. All of them have been thrown together into a vast jungle-like area, surrounded by a domed field, a force field, something which shocks the heroes and villains of this world, but not the ones from Spider-Man's world, seeing as they have heroes like Iron Man and Reed Richards running around and have already perfected armored suits and personal force fields. Then, they are all greeted by a holographic projection of Kraven the Hunter, who welcomed them to his final hunt. He made the rules of the game simple. There were only two ways that this would end. Either with all the people inside, his prey, dead and skinned for trophies, or if he himself was dead, killed by the one who was worthy enough to take it. Then, his army of hunters would arrive, and they would open fire on the crowd. The gathering of unwitting prey would scatter. Some would fall, others would be abandoned, but all would be reduced to a mad rush of panic under the roaring guns of the hunters. Up above, Kraven would watch the show with glee, eager to see which of those who ran would be his final, worthy foe, and would keep his eyes focused on Ida in particular, sensing the violent surge of anger in him. Back on the ground, Spider-Man would do his best to try and scatter the hunters, even employing his new suit and the powers that it gave him, such as shapeshifting and manifesting tendrils, and constructing solid walls of black goo to stop bullets with. However, even he was forced to run when the hunters proved to be too overwhelming, and he resolved to simply rescue as many people as he could from being killed by Kraven's men, even the villains who hated him. Meanwhile, Ida would be forced to duck down under cover alongside a villain that he recognized from the Usji, Delilah. Ida would be angered at the sight of her, but Delilah would instead recognize the raging anger inside of the boy and would be humored like it. She rationalized to him that it would be better for them to work together right now instead of against each other. Ida would be forced to concede her point, and as they moved out, Delilah resolves to herself to unleash the killer instincts inside of him. Back with Spider-Man, he would duck down with the likes of Pandamania, Habit Headgear, and a few others. Resolving to link up with the others and try to put up some sort of resistance against the hunters, the dysfunctional group would be forced to work together to try and gather as many people as possible to organize some sort of counterattack against Kraven's trained killers. Soon, a whole day would pass, and the hunters would gather their first kills to present to their leader as trophies. Kraven would accept them handedly, and soon these corpses would be skinned and hung up as trophies for his wall. The second day of the hunt would begin, and scattered resistance against the hunters would begin as the groups of heroes, villains, and everything in between would begin to fight back. Kazuko and Rukyu's groups would link up and merge together, taking over a bunker that had been set up in the jungle for the hunt, and serve as a rallying point for anyone seeking shelter from the hunters. Mirko, Kirishima, and Kendo Rappa would team up to launch their own guerrilla campaign against the hunters, constantly dipping in and out of fights to disorientate and confuse their enemies. Ochako would find Kimiya, and the two of them would serve as wandering medics and doctors thanks to their previous training and experience in Yue and Feast, with Gentle Criminal and La Brava acting as their bodyguards from the hunters as well. All the while, Spider-Man and his group would move between these scattered pockets of resistance, trying to save as many people as they can and stop any more deaths. However, it isn't all smooth sailing for those that are considered prey. Several heroes and villains alike, such as Black Ant, the Lobo Brothers, Funkman, Kesajiri Man, and Silvermane are killed in the first day, and many more, such as Innsmouth and his siblings, Joystick, Slugger, Iguana, Yith, Master Driller, and Black Belt, are killed in the second. Entire groups of prey, such as Team Reservoir Dogs, turn on each other in a desperate bid for survival, and others begin to fight against each other for whatever scraps they can find, only to be found and either gunned down or sent packing by the hunters. Meanwhile, Ida is forced to stay with Delilah, who continues to poke and prod at him and stoke the anger deep inside of him, before stealing a gun away from a defeated hunter and handing it over to Ida. He resolves not to use it, as he does not want to cross that line. Delilah knows this and is eager to push him over that line. By the time of the third day, things are finally looking up for the scattered resistance against the hunters. Thanks to the efforts of Spider-Man, Rukyu, and Kazuko, the bunker that the survivors have found has been turned into both a fortress and a place of refuge for those escaping from Kraven's men, and together, they begin to organize a plan on how to counterattack against the hunters. Many want to take down the force field surrounding the forest, which they have now identified as somewhere in Japan, and link up with the heroes that are trying to break in themselves, while others want to take down Kraven himself and defeat the hunters in one big battle. Others, however, are simply focused on surviving for another day and saving whoever they can. By the time the third day ends, Kraven is growing impatient. His disease is coming closer and closer to ending his life, and he will not die in a sick if he can choose it. Rallying his hunters to his side, including his new guards and the volcano thieves and wild villains, all of whom are eager to take their revenge on Spider-Man, Kraven takes to the field, wielding Stain's sword and wearing All Might's cloak. When the fourth day arrives, Ida is still wandering about with Delilah, who continues to ask him about how he feels, what he wants, and how he wishes to enact the dark thoughts in his mind. Ida tries to force her out of his head, but Delilah simply continues to rationalize all his dark desires, intent on releasing the killer intent inside of him. Then, they spot Kraven and his hunters moving through the jungle, and Ida sees that Kraven is wielding Stain's sword like a trophy. Realizing that Kraven is the one that killed Stain, Ida is filled with rage, and Delilah smiles at how close to the breaking point he is. At the bunker, the gathered survivors see what Ida is seeing, and find themselves under siege by the army of hunters and their elite units, all under the banner of Kraven. The battle between the survivors and the hunters would be long and grueling, and would last for the better part of an entire day, and the climax of the battle would come when Spider-Man, just after a long battle against the vengeful volcano thieves and the wild villains, he would come face with Kraven himself. And despite all of his new powers, despite the strength that his symbiote suit gave him, Kraven still defeated him. By the day's end, the hunters would overrun the bunker and kill many more people. The survivors would be forced to retreat, and Kraven, believing that the near-dead Spider-Man was completely dead, would bury his foe in a fresh grave and leave with his gains to their headquarters, where he would find himself so very close to the verge of death, and desiring to die at the hands of his worthy foe, would dress himself in a black suit identical to Spider-Man and await the one that would come to face him. However, Peter wasn't as dead as Kraven thought, as his suit had been keeping him in a state of near death after Kraven had beaten him in order to heal his wounds. In the night, the heroes would come to mourn Peter's loss, only to be shocked as they watched Spider-Man dig himself out of his own grave, ready to get back into the fray once more. However, the survivors realized that, after what happened in the bunker, They stand no chance of defeating Craven and his hunters without reinforcements, and that they can't stand against the hunters for another day. Now they have no choice but to attack the force field generator covering the forest in a full frontal assault, as to do otherwise now would be to die. Meanwhile, Ida and Delilah would find themselves at the foot of a great temple, one of the old Japanese samurai castles constructed on hills, one that Craven had made into his personal fortress, and begin to climb, Ida fueled by rage and malice, and Delilah with the wish to see how this would all play out. Soon enough, on the fourth and final day of the great hunt, Craven's army of hunters would spread out into the forest, all of them eager to finish the job and collect their trophies. However, they would find nothing for them to hunt, as the survivors had used the distraction to head to where the force field generator was being held. There, they would be forced against a villain that Craven had taken as a lover, and ordered to manage the generator by the name of Calypso and her undead minions, as well as the volcano thieves and wild villains once more, and would be forced into a long battle against them once more. Meanwhile, Ida and Delilah would make it to the top of Craven's castle, where they would find the hunter meditating, surrounded by the skins of his men and his kills, wearing a black Spider-Man suit and wielding Stain's sword. However, they would be spotted by the hunter, and would engage in a battle with him. It would be a long and grueling fight, but soon enough, Craven would gain the upper hand on an unwitting Delilah and stab her in the gut, killing her. Ida would fly into a rage and attack the hunter, only to find him on the back foot thanks to his opponent's years of experience. If he could not have his revenge against Stain for his brother, then he would have it against Craven. However, Craven would recognize the anger deep within Ida thanks to watching him over the duration of the hunt, and would sense the killer intent in him. With his own illness just about to end him, Craven the hunter would be eager to be felled, if this boy was worthy enough to take it. Meanwhile, the survivors would throw themselves into what might be their final stand, throwing everything that they had into Calypso's zombie minions and the villains that protected them, only for Momo to end the fight by throwing herself at the generator and, via summoning a claw, tearing it in two, destroying it, before taking down Calypso herself and serving her magical control over her revenant followers, leading the zombies to drop to the ground, dead and motionless once more. The force field around the jungle-like forest would come down, and the army of heroes outside, led by All Might, would surge in to rescue the people inside. The hunters would find themselves overwhelmed by hundreds of heroes coming through, and Spider-Man and the other survivors, instead of retreating out of the fight, would leave their wounded to the heroes and head off to Craven's castle, eager to finish what the hunter had started. Back in the castle, Craven would continue to best Ada, encouraging the younger former student to cease holding back, and to give him the warrior's death that he had dreamed of. Ida would lose himself more and more to his bloodlust against the hunter, his anger fueled by the sight of the hunter wielding the sword of the man who killed his brother and wearing the suit like the one who had denied him vengeance. He would throw himself into the fight, giving it everything that he had, and still, it seemed like it just wouldn't be enough. Then, he remembered the gun that the late Delilah had given him, and, in a moment where he finally catches Craven off guard, he uses it, shooting Craven in the chest. The hunter falls to the ground, dying, and Ida tosses the gun aside and picks up Stain's sword. Craven, finally dying as a warrior like he wanted, encourages Ida to finish it. And Spider-Man and the others are too late to stop him, as Ida indulges him and brings the sword down on his head, the blood on his broken armor resembling a skull. Ida has just become this universe's version of the Punisher. Upon coming to his senses, Ida finally realizes what he has done and is horrified. But when he sees the scared and horrified looks on the faces of his friends, Ida panics and flees, going on the run and adopting a new, brutal name and identity for himself. Soon enough, the survivors would leave the forest and go back to their own ways. Peter and his friends, traumatized by what they have been through and the sight of what one of their own had done, would slink back to feast. Sullen and confused, whilst the villains that had been with them would take flight and use their newfound freedom to escape into the wild. However, some villains, like Panda Mania, Hippo, and Gibbon, would follow Peter and his lot back to feast, and, disillusioned by the violence that they had just survived, give up their old ways and become helping hands at the shelter alongside the likes of Twice, Magni, and Mr. Compress. The heroes, meanwhile, would be forced to contend with what happened in the forest, and with how Craven was able to assemble so many followers in the first place. As it turns out, many of Craven's hunters were recruited off the streets as low-level thugs and homeless people kicked out of their houses because of quirk discrimination, and had rallied to Craven's side for the chance of revenge against the society that had wronged them. Worse than that, many of those same hunters were able to escape from the army of heroes in the forest, and had become mercenaries for the various criminal gangs and syndicates that were beginning to come out of hiding, despite the continuous presence of All Might as the #1 hero. Meanwhile, Mirko would decide to take Kendo Rappa, who she recognized from her days as the underground wrestler Tiger Bunny, as her personal sidekick, while Kendo Rappa would leave behind the agency that he was previously working for to take up this new position. In this universe, Overhaul is a pro-hero, but don't think that this makes him a good guy, as soon enough we are shown that he currently has Green Goblin under his thumb. A Green Goblin who is eager to break away from him and take his revenge on Spider-Man. But then, later that night, someone would come knocking on the door of Feast. And when Peter goes to answer, he would be greeted by Uncle Ben,